On October 28, 1922, columns of men dressed in black shirts advanced toward Rome from various points in northern and central Italy. They were not regular troops, nor did they form part of a classic military insurrection. They were armed militants of a recent political movement, socially heterogeneous and still lacking a well-defined doctrine. Many arrived by train, others on foot. The organization was uneven and the actual combat capacity limited. However, the importance of that episode did not lie in the material strength of those columns, but in the political impact they produced on an already weakened state. While the squadristi approached the capital, Benito Mussolini remained in Milan, at the editorial offices of Il Popolo d'Italia, fully aware that the outcome would not be decided in the streets, but in the offices of power. In the royal palace, King Victor Emmanuel III faced a crucial decision. The Liberal government had prepared the decree to declare a state of siege and use the army against the Blackshirts. Prime Minister Luigi Facta presented it in the early morning hours of October 28th. However, the monarch refused to sign it. He feared that armed repression would unleash a civil war and, at the same time, deeply distrusted the parliamentary system's ability to restore a social order that had been eroding for years. With that refusal, the liberal state gave up defending itself. Italy thus became the first European country in which a political force born outside liberal and socialist traditions came to power. That phenomenon, still imprecise and without clear contours, would begin to be known as fascism. The spectacularity of that moment has favored a misleading interpretation, the idea that fascism was the result of a solid and long-elaborated ideology. In reality, the opposite occurred. Before 1919, there was no structured fascist party, nor a coherent fascist doctrine. Unlike liberalism or socialism, which developed over decades through theoretical debates, social struggles, and institutional experiences, fascism emerged abruptly as an improvised response to an unprecedented historical crisis. When Mussolini founded the Fasci di Combattimento in March 1919, he barely gathered 100 people from very different political worlds. Disillusioned former revolutionary syndicalists, radical nationalists, futurists fascinated by violence, and war veterans unable to reintegrate into civilian life. The initial program reflected that confused mixture. It combined advanced social demands with aggressive nationalism and a generalized rejection of the existing political system. There was no defined social base, nor a clear vision of the future. Fascism was not born as a theory, but as a reactive political practice. This genesis helps to understand why it is so difficult to define what exactly fascism was. The term itself is revealing. It comes from fascio, an Italian word meaning bundle or united group, which symbolically alludes to the Roman fasces, ancient emblems of collective authority. Unlike concepts such as democracy, liberalism, or socialism, the term fascism does not by itself indicate a precise political orientation. This ambiguity was not a defect, but a strategic advantage. During its early years, fascist leaders deliberately avoided fixing a closed doctrine. That indefinition allowed them to attract different social groups, even contradictory ones, united more by rejection of the existing order than by a clearly formulated common project. From the beginning, fascism defined itself more by its attitude, its method, and its style of action than by a stable theoretical body. The difficulty in defining it increases when the view is expanded to the whole of interwar Europe. Many movements that today are grouped under the fascist label did not use that name to describe themselves. Each one developed its own identity, symbols, and cultural references. This diversity has led some historians to deny the existence of a general fascist phenomenon. However, comparative analysis shows that these movements shared fundamental features, consistent enough to speak of a specific type of political response that emerged in a very concrete historical context: the profound crisis of the European order after World War I. First, fascism was defined by a series of radical negations. It was anti-liberal because it rejected individualism, pluralism, and parliamentary politics, considered incapable of offering solutions in an era perceived as one of emergency. Parliamentarism, based on negotiation and compromise, was seen as synonymous with weakness. It was anti-communist because it identified Marxism and class struggle as existential threats to the nation. In Italy, the massive strikes and factory occupations after the war generated a real fear of social revolution, especially among agrarian owners, urban middle classes, and business sectors. For many of them, fascist groups appeared as a shock force capable of stopping the left. And it was also anti-conservative on a rhetorical level by despising traditional elites, accusing them of having led the country to disaster through inaction, opportunism and corruption. Although fascism would end up allying with conservative sectors, it always presented itself as a break with the 19th century and its political forms. But fascism was not only an ideology of rejection, it proposed an alternative project for the organization of the state and society. At the center of that project was the idea of an authoritarian, strong and active national state capable of intervening directly to subordinate individual and group interests to the interest of the nation. In contrast to liberalism, which conceived the state as a limited arbiter, and socialism, which aspired to class transformation, fascism imagined a state that absorbed and disciplined society as a whole. The nation was conceived as a living organism, politics as the art of imposing cohesion and hierarchy on its parts. Social conflict was not to be resolved through negotiation between classes, but through their forced integration within a superior state structure. This internal conception of power was accompanied by a critical vision of the international order that emerged after World War I. For broad sectors of public opinion in countries defeated or dissatisfied with the peace treaties, the new European balance was perceived as unjust and humiliating. Fascism channeled that discontent toward the vindication of prestige, strength, and national affirmation. This ambition was not limited to foreign policy. It was part of a broader cultural vision, profoundly voluntarist, that rejected the pacifism and rationalism inherited from the 19th century. Fascism aspired to create a new, modern, mobilized, and secular civilization capable of replacing a world considered exhausted. However, what most visibly distinguished fascism from other contemporary movements was its style. Observers of the era emphasized the novelty of its public acts. In contrast to traditional politics, based on speeches and written programs, fascism gave a central role to aesthetics, symbol and ritual. Uniforms, flags, parades, ritualized salutes and hymns transformed politics into a collective emotional experience. The objective was not only to convince rationally, but to generate a feeling of belonging, discipline and faith in a political community presented as a shared destiny. In 1911, Hans Wilhelm Munch was born in Freiburg into a German middle-class family. His father worked as a forestry superintendent, which placed the family in rural settings where the young Munch spent his early years far from the urban tensions that were beginning to ferment in Germany after the defeat in the First World War. During his adolescence, the family moved to Dresden, a city with a prosperous Jewish community fully integrated into cultural and economic life. There, Munch formed genuine friendships with Jewish classmates, especially with Leo Oppenheimer, with whom he even shared a bicycle trip to Paris. These early relationships would create one of the many paradoxes that would define his later biography. Upon completing secondary school, Munch began medical studies in Tübingen between 1933 and 1935, precisely when Hitler was consolidating his power. He continued his training in Munich until 1938, specializing in bacteriology and hygiene, fields that were strategic for the war machine that was approaching. His relationship with National Socialism during these formative years forms the core of the contradictions that would define his role in Auschwitz. In September of 1937, while still a student, Munch formally joined the Nazi Party, a decision he would later justify as purely pragmatic. According to explanations he gave decades later, this affiliation was not due to ideological conviction, but to the practical demands needed to secure his professional future in Munich, the birthplace of the Nazi movement, where pressure to demonstrate loyalty to the regime was especially intense. Before joining the party in 1935, he had joined the NSKK, National Socialist Motor Corps, which, according to his testimony, represented the least politically compromising option among the organizations university students were required to join. Munch's mother, according to his recollections, maintained a firmly anti-national socialist stance, expressing visceral hatred toward Hitler, while his father remained in a position of indifference that was itself a form of accommodation. This family dynamic generated tensions that Munch would remember in detail, especially the arguments in which his mother reproached him for having joined the party, even without conviction, while he Hitler and Mussolini, two paths toward European totalitarian control. The crisis that opened the doors to fascism did not end with the armistice of 1918. On the contrary, it intensified in the months that followed. Italy formally figured among the victorious powers, but the human and material toll had been devastating. More than 600,000 dead, 1 million wounded, a multiplied public debt, and persistent inflation had eroded the foundations of daily life. To this economic wound was added a profound political frustration. At the Versailles Conference, the promises of territorial expansion and imperial prestige with which the population had been mobilized did not materialize. The expression "mutilated victory" condensed that feeling of empty triumph, of sacrifice without reward, which deeply affected veterans, impoverished middle classes, and nationalist sectors. That discontent would have been manageable for the liberal state if it had not coincided with a social upheaval of greater scope. Between 1919 and 1920, Italy went through the so-called Biennio Rosso, Red Biennium, 2 years of unprecedented worker and peasant mobilization. The Italian Socialist Party tripled its vote compared to the pre-war period and became the most numerous parliamentary force. In municipalities, socialists occupied mayoralties and councils. In the countryside and in industry, unions promoted massive strikes and occupations. The most disturbing episode for the elites came in September 1920, when metalworkers in Turin took control of the factories and put them to work under self-management. The recent Russian Revolution offered a tangible reference. For many owners and officials, the Bolshevik spectre seemed to be advancing westward. The threat was perceived with particular intensity in the Po Valley, the agricultural and industrial core of the north. There, socialist strengthening translated into effective control of the rural labor market. The labor exchanges, managed by unions, became obligatory intermediaries between owners and day laborers. Landowners had to accept annual contracts, higher wages, and conditions they considered ruinous. Beyond the economic impact, the symbolic blow was decisive. Men accustomed to exercising absolute authority on their estates now found themselves obliged to negotiate in offices controlled by those who had been their subordinates. Faced with this situation, the large landowners sought help from the liberal state, but found it absent or reluctant. Many local officials sympathized with the socialists or feared provoking an escalation of violence. Prime Minister Giovanni Giolitti, representative of a pragmatic liberalism of the late 19th century, refused to use the army to break strikes. He trusted that social balance would emerge from the play of forces itself. For the landowners, that neutrality was equivalent to abandonment. The feeling that the state had lost authority and will to command spread rapidly among those who most feared a social revolution. It was in that vacuum where a new form of politics emerged, based not on detailed programs but on direct action. The Squadre d'Azione, action squads, armed groups of nationalist militants, first appeared as local initiatives in the rural areas of the north. Many of their members were war veterans accustomed to discipline and organized violence. Dressed in black shirts, a symbol that would soon give its name to the movement, they presented themselves as defenders of the nation against internal enemies. On November 21, 1920, their violent eruption into the socialist city hall of Bologna left 6 dead and marked a turning point. From then on, punitive expeditions multiplied throughout the Po Delta. Squadrist violence followed precise patterns. At night, armed groups set fire to union headquarters, looted socialist newspapers, beat worker leaders, and applied rituals of public humiliation, such as forcing them to ingest castor oil or shaving moustaches in half. Between January and April 1921, more than 100 people died. In a few months, dozens of houses of the people, cooperatives, and labor chambers were destroyed. However, that violence was not chaotic. It transmitted a clear message. Socialism brought disorder, and the democratic state was incapable of protecting the nation. Only an implacable force could restore order. To coercion was added a pragmatic political offer. The fascists broke the socialist monopoly on agricultural contracting and promised work to landless peasants. Some owners, seeking stability, ceded small plots to followers of the movement. Thus, rural sectors that had supported the left began to shift toward fascism, not out of deep ideological adherence, but because of the immediate promise of security and subsistence. The advance of the Squadre would have been impossible without the connivance of broad sectors of the state apparatus. Prefects, police officers, and local military commanders provided weapons, trucks, or simply looked the other way. By early 1922, the squadrist leaders, known as Ras in allusion to African chieftains, exercised de facto power in large areas of the northeast. The liberal state no longer monopolized violence, it negotiated with those who practiced it. This process transformed the social composition of fascism. The movement, founded in 1919, had brought together radical veterans, nationalist syndicalists, and futurist intellectuals who dreamed of a social revolution accompanied by national greatness. The squadrist phase attracted instead sons of landowners, opportunists, and criminal elements. Many of the early idealists denounced the drift and left the party. Benito Mussolini, however, understood that power resided in that new alliance. He opted for the armed men and marginalized the purists. The decision proved decisive in 1921. When Giolitti called parliamentary elections, he included the fascists in a coalition alongside liberals and nationalists, hoping to domesticate them. 35 fascist candidates won seats, among them Mussolini. The movement ceased to be a marginal street force and entered the institutional arena. Violence did not disappear, but now coexisted with parliamentary legality. During 1922, the squadristi raised the stakes. From local assaults, they moved to the occupation of entire cities such as Ferrara, Bologna, or Cremona. Each action reinforced the perception that the state had lost control. In October, gathered in Naples, the fascist leaders decided to test their symbolic and political strength. The so-called March on Rome on October 28, 1922, was conceived as a demonstration of pressure more than as a coherent military insurrection. The result was, in strictly operational terms, a failure. Security forces blocked trains and dispersed columns. Barely a few thousand blackshirts, poorly equipped and disorganized, reached the gates of the capital in the rain. The government of Prime Minister Luigi Facta had prepared martial law with the initial support of the monarch. However, at the decisive moment, King Victor Emmanuel III hesitated. Fearing a civil war and distrusting the solidity of the parliamentary system, he refused to sign the decree and opted for a compromise solution, to offer Mussolini the position of Prime Minister. Thus, on October 30, 1922, Mussolini arrived in Rome by train, not as an armed conqueror but as a politician summoned by the crown. The image summarized the paradox of Italian fascism, a seizure of power that combined prior violence, street pressure, and legal acceptance by the traditional elites. It was not a classic revolution, but the consequence of a weakened state that chose to integrate those who promised to restore order by any means. With that gesture, Italy entered a new phase. Fascism had crossed the threshold of national power, but still had to transform itself from a violent movement into a stable regime. While Mussolini began to govern, others watched attentively from outside. In Germany, a frustrated veteran followed the Italian experiment with interest, convinced that in the post-war crisis opportunities were also hidden. That story, marked by defeats, resentments, and even more radical bets, would begin to develop in parallel and with decisive consequences for Europe. While Italian fascism was making its way between organized violence and the acquiescence of the elites, Germany was going through its own post-war period under even more corrosive signs. The defeat of 1918 had not only destroyed the German Empire, it had broken the symbolic framework that for decades had sustained political and social loyalty. Millions of soldiers returned to a civilian life for which they were not prepared, with the feeling of having been betrayed from within. In that breeding ground, the so-called stab-in-the-back legend flourished, the belief that the army had not been defeated on the battlefield, but sabotaged by Marxists, Democrats, and Jews. This narrative, lacking any real basis, proved psychologically powerful and politically explosive. The new political order, the Weimar Republic, was born in 1919 with one of the most advanced constitutions of its time: universal suffrage, broad civil liberties, and a modern parliamentary system. However, that democratic architecture lacked emotional legitimacy from the start for broad sectors of the population. Weimar became associated with the humiliation of the Treaty of Versailles, which imposed territorial losses, severe military limitations, and financial reparations perceived as unbearable. The Republic was not seen as a collective achievement, but as an imposition of the enemy accepted by weak politicians. In that context, the figure of Adolf Hitler emerged, a war veteran without academic training or a defined professional career. During the conflict, he had served as a messenger on the Western Front, an experience that reinforced his sense of discipline and his Manichaean worldview. The defeat left him disoriented, but also convinced that Germany needed a radical regeneration. Like many other demobilized soldiers, he gravitated toward the nationalist circles of Munich, a city that had become a refuge for far-right movements hostile to Berlin and the Republic. In September 1919, Hitler joined a small marginal group, the German Workers' Party, soon renamed the National Socialist German Workers' Party. His oratorical talent proved decisive. In improvised rallies, he transformed diffuse frustrations into concrete accusations and offered a total explanation for the national disaster based on internal and external enemies. By 1921, he had already displaced the original founders and had become the undisputed leader of the party. Inspired by the Italian example, Hitler believed a rapid seizure of power was possible through armed pressure and the backing of conservative figures. In November 1923, he attempted to replicate the March on Rome with the so-called Beer Hall Putsch. During a rally at the Bürgerbräukeller in Munich, he tried to force the Bavarian authorities to join a coup against the federal government. The plan rested on erroneous assumptions, that the prestige of General Ludendorff would be enough to drag the army along, and that the police would not dare fire on nationalist veterans. The reality was different. The Bavarian authorities, led by Gustav von Kahr, defended the existing order. On November 9th, the police opened fire on the putschists as they marched toward the city centre. 14 Nazis and 4 officers died. Hitler was arrested and sentenced to prison. The coup had failed in humiliating fashion, demonstrating that the German state, unlike the Italian one of 1922, still retained coercive capacity and the will to use it. The experience left a lasting lesson. During his imprisonment at Landsberg, Hitler wrote Mein Kampf, a work that mixed autobiography, racial ideology, and political program. More importantly, he drew a strategic conclusion. Power in Germany could not be taken by open force, but through a combination of apparent legality and mass mobilization. The Nazi Party adopted a long-term tactic: participate in elections, build a national organization, and present itself as a legitimate alternative within the system, without renouncing selective violence as an instrument of intimidation. During the second half of the 1920s, that strategy seemed doomed to failure. Germany experienced a relative stabilization thanks to the restructuring of reparations and the influx of American capital. Inflation was controlled, production recovered, and cultural life flourished. In the 1928 elections, the Nazis obtained barely 2.8% of the votes. For many observers, the movement seemed destined for irrelevance. However, this calm rested on fragile foundations. The German economy depended heavily on foreign loans. When the Wall Street crash in October 1929 triggered a global depression, that dependence became a mortal trap. Credits evaporated, banks collapsed, and industrial production was cut in half. Unemployment reached 1 in 4 workers. The crisis not only destroyed livelihoods, it pulverized confidence in the democratic system's ability to offer solutions. The political impact was immediate. The coalition government led by Hermann Müller collapsed in 1930 amid disagreements over social spending. From then on, Germany was governed through emergency decrees signed by President Paul von Hindenburg, using Article 48 of the Constitution. Parliament was paralyzed, and democracy was emptied of content without the need to formally abolish it. That institutional blockade created the space Hitler had been waiting for. The Nazis intensified their campaign, presenting themselves as a national movement capable of overcoming class struggle and restoring German pride. Their message was deliberately flexible. They promised protection to indebted farmers, employment to unemployed workers, order to the middle classes, and greatness to nationalists. While other parties spoke to specific electorates, the Nazis spoke to the entire nation, even though those promises contradicted each other. Thus, entering the 1930s, Germany found itself trapped between a devastating economic crisis and a political system incapable of responding. The Nazi Party, which had learned from the failure of 1923, was prepared to exploit that juncture with an effectiveness few anticipated. In the next stretch, the depression, street violence, and the maneuvers of conservative elites would converge to bring Hitler to the threshold of power, closing the circle begun after the defeat of 1918. The Great Depression not only aggravated material misery in Germany, it decisively altered the psychological and political balance of society. Millions of people who had reluctantly accepted the Weimar Republic while it guaranteed economic stability began to see it as a useless regime, incapable of protecting them from collapse. In that climate of desperation, the Nazi message stopped seeming extremist and began to sound pragmatic. Mass unemployment, the bankruptcy of small businesses, and the loss of status of broad layers of the middle class eroded ties with traditional parties, perceived as accomplices to the failure. Adolf Hitler demonstrated a remarkable ability to translate that frustration into political mobilization. The Nazi campaign combined modern methods and archaic violence. Airplanes and luxury automobiles allowed the leader to travel the country quickly, projecting an image of dynamism and modernity. At the same time, the stormtroopers, the SA, dominated the streets with physical intimidation. Rallies were carefully designed choreographies to produce a collective emotional experience, very different from the rational and lengthy speeches of traditional parties. Politics became spectacle and ritual. The electoral advance was rapid. In 1930, the Nazis went from marginality to becoming the second force in the Reichstag. 2 years later, in July 1932, they reached 37% of the votes, becoming the largest party in Germany. They did not achieve an absolute majority, but their weight was already unavoidable. No stable government could be formed without them, or without permanently resorting to presidential emergency decrees. Hitler, aware of his position, rejected any post other than the chancellorship. The conservative elites reacted with a mixture of fear and calculation. Many shared the visceral rejection of socialism and communism and saw the Nazis as a useful force to mobilize the masses in defense of the social order. Chancellor Franz von Papen believed he could control Hitler by integrating him into a government dominated by traditional conservatives. After a series of intrigues and failures, that logic prevailed. On January 30th, 1933, the elderly President Hindenburg appointed Hitler Chancellor at the head of a coalition in which the Nazis held only 3 ministries. The bet was clear: use Hitler's charisma and the party's street force, while real power would remain in experienced hands. The illusion lasted only a few weeks. The fire at the Reichstag building on February 28, 1933, provided the new Chancellor with the decisive opportunity. Although the material author was probably an isolated communist activist, the event was interpreted and exploited as proof of an imminent revolutionary conspiracy. Under that premise, Hindenburg signed the Decree for the Protection of the People and the State, which suspended fundamental liberties and allowed mass arrests without judicial control. Repression immediately fell upon communists, social democrats, and other opponents. The elections called for March 1933 were held in a climate of widespread intimidation. Even so, the Nazis did not obtain an absolute majority. The final piece was the Enabling Act, passed on March 24th, which granted the government extraordinary legislative powers for 4 years. With the support of the Catholic Centre Party and the Nationalist Conservatives, Hitler achieved the necessary 2/3 majority. The dictatorship was born by legal means, using the mechanisms of the Constitution itself to nullify it. In the following months, the regime consolidated rapidly. Political parties were dissolved, independent unions abolished and replaced by state-controlled organizations. The first concentration camps, such as Dachau, were established to intern real or potential opponents. The initial street violence gave way to a more systematic and bureaucratic terror. When Hindenburg died in August 1934, Hitler merged the functions of president and chancellor, becoming Führer of the Reich. The army swore personal loyalty to the new leader, sealing the subordination of a key institution. Meanwhile, Italy was experiencing its own process of authoritarian hardening, although with different rhythms and balances. Benito Mussolini had governed between 1922 and 1924 within a formal parliamentary framework, supported by liberals, nationalists, and Catholic sectors. However, the permanent presence of the squadristi and the pressure from the RAS kept the regime in tension. Many militants demanded a second revolution that would reward those who had brought fascism to power through violence. The assassination of the socialist deputy Giacomo Matteotti in June 1924 marked a turning point. Matteotti had denounced in Parliament the fascist corruption and intimidation during the elections. His kidnapping and murder provoked a deep political crisis. For months, Mussolini seemed to waver, while the opposition abandoned Parliament in a gesture of protest that, paradoxically, weakened its capacity for action. The conservative elites and the king then had a real possibility of removing the Duce, but they opted for inaction. Pressured by the squadrist leaders and aware of the paralysis of his adversaries, Mussolini decided to advance. On January 3, 1925, in a calculatedly defiant speech, he assumed political responsibility for the violence and announced the end of pluralism. In the following 2 years, a series of laws transformed Italy into a single-party dictatorship. Parties were dissolved, freedom of the press was suppressed, elected mayors were replaced by appointed officials, and fascist unions obtained a monopoly on labor representation. Unlike the German case, Italian fascism maintained a more ambiguous relationship with traditional elites. Mussolini needed to constantly negotiate with the monarchy, the church, and major economic interests. The regime presented itself as a guarantor of social order and harmony between classes through the so-called corporate state. This structure promised to overcome social conflict by integrating workers and employers into state-controlled corporations, although in practice it consolidated the power of the government and large industrialists. By 1934, both Germany and Italy had completed the transition from marginal radical movements to consolidated authoritarian regimes. However, the differences between them were already evident. While Mussolini balanced his power with traditional institutions and avoided a total break with them, Hitler was advancing toward a more personal and total form of domination, eliminating rivals even within his own movement, as that same year the bloody purge known as the Night of the Long Knives would demonstrate. European fascism had achieved internal stability, but at the price of a radicalization that would soon seek an outlet beyond national borders. The stabilization of both regimes did not mean the end of internal tensions, but their reordering under new rules. Once in power, both Italian fascism and German National Socialism had to solve a common structural problem: how to transform movements born of violence, agitation, and street mobilization into lasting systems of government capable of administering complex states. That transition demanded discipline, hierarchy, and control, qualities that clashed with the expectations of many militants who had risked their lives in the initial phases and expected immediate rewards. In Germany, the challenge was particularly acute. The SA, which had been fundamental to Adolf Hitler's rise, had become a mass force of several million men, many of them unemployed and radicalized. Its leaders aspired to a social second revolution that would replace traditional elites and turn the SA into the core of a new people's army. These ambitions alarmed the military high command, major industrialists and conservative sectors whose support Hitler still needed. The result was a calculated and brutal decision. On the night of June 30th, 1934, the so-called Night of the Long Knives physically eliminated the SA leadership, including its chief Ernst Röhm, along with other real or potential adversaries. The message was unequivocal. Loyalty to the Führer was above any revolutionary camaraderie. The army, reassured, accepted the new order and swore personal allegiance to Hitler after the death of President Hindenburg a few weeks later. In Italy, the process was less bloody but more prolonged. Benito Mussolini also had to contain the provincial RAS, whose local powers and memories of squadrismo threatened to overflow central authority. The Duce oscillated between concessions and selective punishments, using promotions, dismissals, and internal party reorganizations to reduce their autonomy. Unlike Germany, there was no comparable mass purge. Italian fascism preferred to absorb and domesticate its radicals rather than openly eliminate them. Both regimes soon understood that coercion, although essential, was not enough to sustain themselves in the long term. It was necessary to produce consent, or at least passive acceptance. In this area, they deployed a combination of limited social policies, omnipresent propaganda, and mechanisms of integration. In Germany, the rapid decline in unemployment, driven by public works, covert rearmament, and the systematic exclusion of women and Jews from the labor market, generated a perception of recovery. Organizations like Strength Through Joy offered subsidized vacations, cultural activities, and a sense of national belonging. In Italy, the regime promoted symbolic works, demographic campaigns, and the image of a state acting as arbiter between classes. The relationship with traditional institutions was another pillar of consolidation. In Italy, the agreement with the Catholic Church proved decisive. The Lateran Pacts of 1929 resolved a conflict that had been open since Italian unification, recognizing Vatican sovereignty and granting Catholicism a privileged status. In exchange, the Church provided moral legitimacy to the regime, facilitating broad popular support that was reflected in carefully controlled plebiscites. Germany did not achieve such a stable agreement with religious denominations, but it signed concordats and avoided direct confrontation in this phase, prioritizing gradual neutralization. Control of the state apparatus was completed through the subordination of the police and bureaucracy. In Germany, the SS, under the direction of Heinrich Himmler, expanded from a personal guard to become a state within the state, controlling the political police and the concentration camp system. In Italy, the public administration was largely preserved, but subjected to constant surveillance and the primacy of the party. In both cases, career officials quickly understood that obedience guaranteed personal stability. By the mid-1930s, social support for the regimes was real, although uneven. It was not a uniform or always enthusiastic adherence, but a mixture of conviction, opportunism, and resignation. Young people in particular were a central target. Youth organizations, collective rituals, and an aesthetic of strength and renewal shaped entire generations. Politics penetrated daily life to levels unknown in previous liberal democracies. By 1936, internal consolidation was essentially complete. Italy presented itself as an authoritarian corporate state, with strong personal leadership, but still in dialogue with the monarchy, church, and economic elites. Germany, on the other hand, had advanced toward a more radical form of domination, in which Hitler's will imposed itself over all institutions without stable mediations. This structural difference would mark divergent trajectories in the short term. However, both regimes shared a fundamental trait. Their legitimacy rested on the promise of national greatness and the overcoming of past humiliations. Once the possibilities of internal mobilization were exhausted, that promise demanded realization abroad. Expansionist policy, still wrapped in a language of historical reparation and national defense, was beginning to take shape as the next inevitable stage. Thus, the years of crisis, selective violence, conservative pacts, and eroded legality had led to two consolidated dictatorships. Europe was entering a new and dangerous phase, in which the order built after World War I would be put to the ultimate test. Operation Barbarossa and the Holocaust, the total radicalization of the Nazi regime. By 1936, both Mussolini and Hitler had consolidated their dictatorships, but neither could simply allow himself to settle comfortably into power. Charismatic fascist leaders had made dramatic promises to unify, purify, and energize their communities, to save them from the weakness of bourgeois materialism, from the confusion of democratic politics, and from the contamination of foreign peoples and cultures. They had promised their peoples a privileged relationship with history. Fulfilling these promises required producing an impression of constant momentum, of permanent revolution. Without that dizzying and intoxicating race forward, fascist regimes risked declining into something resembling lukewarm authoritarianism. With it, they hurtled toward a final paroxysm of self-destruction. War was the indispensable instrument of this dynamic. Mussolini expressed it with brutal clarity. When Spain was over, he would think of something else, because the character of the Italian people had to be shaped through combat. War was for men what maternity was for women. Hitler shared this vision. Every fiber of the Nazi regime had been tensed toward the business of preparing Germany materially and psychologically for war, and not using that force sooner or later would produce a potentially fatal loss of credibility. Mussolini took the first step toward radicalization in October 1935 with the invasion of Ethiopia. The decision arose both from the need to revive fascist dynamism and from traditional nationalist imperialist dreams and revenge for the Italian defeat at Adwa in 1896. In the early 1930s, the fascist regime faced an identity crisis. It had been in power for a decade. The black shirts were becoming complacent, and party ranks had opened to anyone. Many young people were coming of age without knowing the heroic days of fascism, perceiving fascists only as comfortable climbers. The Ethiopian campaign, although it required more Italian effort than expected, culminated in victory on May 9, 1936. From the balcony of his offices in the Palazzo Venezia in Rome, Mussolini held a triumphal dialogue with the enthusiastic crowd. He declared that Italy had created the empire with its blood, would fertilize it with its work, and would defend it with its arms against anyone. The Ethiopian War gave the Fascist Party a new impulse. It was the occasion for masterful nationalist theatre, the collection of gold wedding rings from the women of Italy, from Queen Elena on down, to help pay for the campaign. The excitement of the war effort was accompanied by a cultural revolution and a totalitarian leap at home. Party Secretary Achilles Starus led a campaign to forge the new fascist man by instituting fascist customs, fascist language, and racial legislation. The reform of customs replaced the deferential and formal way of saying "you" in the third person with the more familiar and comradely second person. The fascist salute replaced the bourgeois handshake. Public officials were dressed in uniforms, and the army began to march with the exaggerated high step that the regime called the Roman step, to make clear it was not copied from the Nazi goose step. The most surprising step was discriminatory legislation against Jews. In July 1938, a manifesto of fascist racism announced the new policy, soon followed by laws prohibiting interracial marriage and excluding Jews from government service and the professions. 1 in 12 university professors had to leave their chairs. The physicist Enrico Fermi, Nobel Prize winner and not Jewish himself, voluntarily departed for the United States because he was deprived of many of his research associates. It is usually assumed that the fascists copied the Nazi racial laws to please Hitler during the period of alignment of Italian foreign policy with the Axis. Italy had been largely devoid of anti-Semitism, and its small and ancient Jewish community had been exceptionally well integrated. But on closer inspection, Italian stems can be found onto which a native anti-Semitism could be grafted. Policies of racial discrimination had already become acceptable to Italians in the colonies. First in Libya and then in Ethiopia, the Italian military adopted tactics of separating nomads from their animals and from food and water, interning them en masse. Meanwhile, Hitler was advancing along his own path toward war. In March 1938, Germany annexed Austria without firing a shot. In September, the Munich agreements handed him the Czechoslovak Sudetenland. In March 1939, German troops invaded the rest of Czechoslovakia. Impressed by this display of force without Franco-British reaction, Mussolini ordered Italian troops to invade Albania as soon as possible. In just 2 days, between April 7th and 8th, 1939, with the help of 22,000 men and 140 tanks, Italian armed forces occupied the small Balkan kingdom. On May 22nd, the Pact of Steel was signed between Germany and Italy. This treaty assumed that war was imminent and committed Italy's support in case Germany suffered any attack. Some members of the Italian government opposed such a close alliance. Galeazzo Ciano himself, Mussolini's son-in-law and foreign minister, called the pact genuine dynamite. On September 1st, 1939, Germany invaded Poland. The German army quickly conquered Polish territory in a display of its blitzkrieg tactics, taking Warsaw after 4 weeks. France and Great Britain declared war on Germany on September 3rd. Mussolini, awaiting events and under Ciano's advice, declared Italy as non-belligerent, avoiding its involvement in the conflict from its beginnings. This gesture was very poorly received by Nazi Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop, who judged Italian intervention necessary to discourage France and Great Britain. In June 1940, Mussolini was impressed by the rapid and easy German victory over France. Convinced of the imminent triumph of the Nazi-fascist alliance, Italy declared war on France and Great Britain on June 10th, when the German Wehrmacht was about to take Paris. Mussolini and much of the fascist hierarchy were convinced that once France was defeated, Great Britain would capitulate shortly, allowing Italy to obtain ample territorial gains as war spoils. But the Italian campaign turned out to be a humiliating failure. On June 21st, 325,000 Italian soldiers invaded the French Alps. After 3 days of fighting, Italian divisions advanced only 2 kilometers, suffering 6,000 casualties against 250 on the French side. US President Franklin Roosevelt went so far as to define the action as a stab in the back. The armistice, signed on June 24th, allowed the Italians to occupy barely the zones that were actually under their control, which was reduced to the small border resort of Menton and its surroundings. The disasters multiplied. In September 1940, Italian troops under the command of General Rodolfo Graziani invaded Egypt from Libya, but their advance stopped after 70 kilometers. When Mussolini launched the invasion of Greece on October 28th, without alerting his German ally, Italian divisions soon found themselves in difficulties due to unexpected Greek resistance and lack of adequate equipment. After a month of campaigning, Greek forces had not only stopped the invaders, but had counterattacked with notable success, penetrating into Italian-controlled Albania. In December, British forces launched a devastating counter-offensive in Libya, decisively defeating Italian troops. They penetrated more than 300 kilometers into Libyan territory, taking Benghazi, Derna, and Tobruk. The Italian army lost 3,000 men killed and left 120,000 prisoners in British hands. Faced with this disaster, from February 1941, the German Afrika Korps operated in Libya under the command of General Erwin Rommel, sent by Hitler with the mission of supporting the Italian war effort. The serious setbacks showed the fascist regime the economic and industrial precariousness of Italy, as well as the poor preparation of its armed forces. This contrasted brutally with Germany's overwhelming military superiority. Italy had introduced severe rationing measures that were not reflected in military victories, which greatly reduced the regime's popularity among the masses. For Hitler, June 22, 1941 marked the beginning of his most radical gamble. That day, contravening the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact, around 3,800,000 Axis soldiers attacked the Soviet Union in Operation Barbarossa. This large-scale offensive had as its declared objective acquiring living space for the German people, but it also intended to destroy the Soviet Union and seize its natural resources. The reaction among Germans was one of surprise and fear, as many were worried about how much longer the war would last, or suspected that Germany could not win a war on 2 fronts. The invasion was accompanied by an unprecedented radicalization of Nazi racial policy. In the conquered territories of Poland and the Soviet Union, parallel party organizations felt free to carry out their most extreme fantasies of racial cleansing, liberated from the remaining restrictions of the normative state. In this no-man's land composed of conquered territories, Nazi party radicals felt freedom to express their hatreds and obsessions in ways that were alien to the traditions of state services. The murder of European Jews developed step by step, from minor acts to more atrocious ones. The first phase was segregation, marking internal enemies, separating them from the nation, and suppressing their rights as citizens. The Nuremberg Laws of September 1935 prohibited interracial marriage and annulled Jewish citizenship. When street violence erupted again in November 1938 in the synagogue burnings and shop destruction of Kristallnacht, other Nazi authorities sought to channel this grassroots action toward a more orderly state policy of Aryanization of Jewish businesses. Segregation reached its climax with the marking of the Jewish population, first in occupied Poland in late 1939 and then in the Reich in August 1941. All Jews had to wear a yellow Star of David sewn to the chest of their outer garments. The next phase was expulsion. This policy germinated in the mixture of challenge and opportunity presented by the annexation of Austria in March 1938, which increased the number of Jews in the Reich and at the same time gave the Nazis more freedom to treat them harshly. The German conquest of the western half of Poland in September 1939 brought millions more Jews. The killing of large numbers of the Polish and Jewish male elite by special military units, the Einsatzgruppen, was an integral part of the Polish campaign, but for the Jewish population in general, expulsion remained the ultimate goal. Problems arose when individual Nazi administrators tried to expel their Jews to territory governed by another. Many officials thought of the occupied area of former Poland as an ideal dumping ground for Jews, but its governor Hans Frank wanted to make his territory a model colony by expelling Polish Jews eastward. The Nazis hoped that invading the Soviet Union in June 1941 would again facilitate expulsion, opening up the vast Russian interior into which to expel them. Detailed studies of Nazi-occupied territories in Poland and the Soviet Union between September 1939 and late 1941 show surprising amounts of individual latitude and local variation among Nazi administrators in their treatment of Jews. Left to fend for themselves with unexpectedly severe problems of security, supply, land tenure and disease, they experimented with all kinds of local initiatives: ghettoization, forced labor, resettlements. In the newly occupied Baltic states and eastern Poland, some Nazi administrators crossed the line from killing Jewish men for security reasons to mass murder of entire Jewish populations, including women and children, as early as August and September 1941, apparently on local initiative, though confident of Berlin's approval. Exactly when and why the old policy of expulsion, punctuated by the killing of many Jewish men for security reasons, gave way in Nazi-occupied Eastern Europe to a new policy of total extermination of all Jews, including women and children, remains one of the most debated topics. It is likely that Hitler issued some kind of verbal order in autumn 1941 in response to the ongoing campaign against Soviet Russia, either in the euphoria of the first advance or more probably in rage when it failed to take Moscow before winter. A plausible recent theory places Hitler's order in a secret speech to senior party officials on December 12, 1941, as a reaction to the entry of the United States into the war and its transformation into a truly global conflict. Two types of developments help explain how a readiness to kill all Jews, including women and children, was constructed. One was a series of dress rehearsals that served to reduce inhibitions and provided trained and hardened personnel for anything. First came the euthanasia of incurably ill and insane Germans, begun on the day World War II started. The T4 program killed more than 70,000 people between September 1939 and 1941. Some of the experts trained in this program were later transferred to the occupied East, where they applied their techniques of mass murder to the Jews. The second dress rehearsal was the work of the Einsatzgruppen, the intervention squads specially tasked with executing the political and cultural elite of invaded countries. In the Polish campaign of September 1939, they helped eliminate the Polish intelligentsia and senior civil service. In the Soviet campaign, they received the notorious Commissar order to kill all Communist Party cadres, as well as the Jewish leadership, along with gypsies. A third dress rehearsal was the intentional death of millions of Soviet prisoners of war. It was on about 600 of them that Nazi occupation authorities first tested the mass murder potential of the commercial insecticide Zyklon B at Auschwitz on September 3, 1941. Most Soviet prisoners, however, were simply worked or starved to death. The second category of developments that helped prepare a readiness to murder consisted of blockages, emergencies and crises that made Jews become an apparently unbearable burden for administrators of conquered territories. One major blockage was the failure to capture Moscow, which cut off the anticipated expulsion of all Jews from conquered Eastern Europe into the Soviet interior. One major emergency was the shortage of food supplies for the German invasion force. German military planners had chosen to feed the invading force from the resources of invaded areas, with full knowledge that this meant famine for local populations. When local supplies fell below expectations, the search for useless mouths began. The first mass executions were accomplished by shooting, a process that was slow, messy, and psychologically stressful for the killers. The search for more efficient killing techniques led to the development of specially prepared vans into which exhaust gases were pumped, an idea derived from the trailers in which mental patients had been gassed with carbon monoxide in Poland in 1940. In autumn 1941, 30 such vans were constructed for the mass liquidation of Jewish populations in occupied Russia. Even faster technology was adopted in spring 1942, when fixed killing installations were built at 6 camps in former Polish territory. Most continued to use carbon monoxide, but some, notably Auschwitz, used the faster and easier-to-handle Zyklon B. The new centers for industrialized mass murder were built beyond the reach of the German normative state and German law. 2 were in territory annexed from Poland in 1939, and the other 4 located in the former Polish lands, now known as the General Government. There, military authorities shared power with civilian officials composed largely of party militants. In captured areas of Poland and the Soviet Union, parallel organizations had more freedom than in the Reich. In that no man's land, both bureaucratic regularity and moral principles were easily set aside, and the needs of the master race became the sole criterion for action. We can dismiss any notion that the Nazi regime murdered Jews to gratify German public opinion. It took elaborate precautions to hide these actions from the German people and from foreign observers. In official documents, the responsible authorities referred to the killings with euphemisms such as special treatment. At the same time, there was no particular effort to keep the secret from German troops on the Eastern Front, many of whom were regularly assigned to participate. Knowledge within Germany that terrible things were being done to Jews in the East was fairly widespread. As long as disorderly destruction like the shop smashing of Kristallnacht did not occur under their windows, most of them let distance, indifference, fear of denunciation, and their own sufferings under Allied bombing stifle any objections. By 1943, the military situation of the Axis looked unpromising. Italy had lost all its colonial empire, its fleet had been almost destroyed in the Mediterranean. Germany had suffered a devastating defeat at Stalingrad, and was losing almost all its advances in the Caucasus and eastern Ukraine. In Italy, discontent reached the popular masses in the face of the endless succession of military defeats and the privations of daily life. On July 9, 1943, British and American troops launched the invasion of Sicily, the first advance onto the territory of an Axis country. In this context, on July 25th, the Fascist Grand Council voted a motion to restore to the king the powers of appointing the Prime Minister. The next day, King Victor Emmanuel summoned Mussolini and dismissed him, ordering his arrest. He was replaced by General Pietro Badoglio. The overthrow of Mussolini generated alarm in Hitler, who ordered the Wehrmacht to prepare to occupy Italy. While Badoglio publicly maintained the alliance with Germany, he initiated secret contacts with the British and Americans. On September 8, 1943, the armistice of Cassibile was announced, but it was not communicated in advance to Italian military chiefs, who fell prey to total confusion. Without a large-scale Allied operation to support them, the Italian army rapidly dissolved in a few days, with soldiers and officers abandoning positions and returning to their homes. The Wehrmacht then launched its troops to occupy Italy without finding appreciable resistance. Faced with the danger of suffering German reprisals, the king and Badoglio fled Rome on the night of September 9th, taking refuge in Brindisi, already in Allied hands. Italy became a battlefield between Germans penetrating from the north and Allies advancing from the south. On September 12th, a German commando led by SS Captain Otto Skorzeny freed Mussolini from his captivity. Hitler reinstated the Duce as dictator of a fascist republic whose capital was at Salo on Lake Garda. The Italian Social Republic was never more than a German puppet, but it is of interest for its regression to the radical impulses of fascism's early days. At Salo, Mussolini surrounded himself with party fanatics and pro-Nazi officers. The new program of the Republican Fascist Party of November 1943 called for the socialization of sectors of the economy necessary for self-sufficiency, leaving in private hands only property that was the fruit of personal effort and savings. The Salo Republic sought revenge against the traitors to Mussolini within fascism, executing 5 members of the Fascist Grand Council who had voted against him, including his own son-in-law Count Ciano, in January 1944. Meanwhile, in Germany, Hitler's refusal to admit defeat and his insistence that the war be fought to the last man led to unnecessary deaths and destruction in the final months. Through his Minister of Justice, Hitler ordered that anyone not prepared to fight be court-martialed, and thousands were executed. Hitler ordered the destruction of transport, bridges, industries and other infrastructure in a scorched earth decree, although Armaments Minister Albert Speer prevented this order from being fully carried out. On April 30, 1945, when Soviet troops were 2 blocks from the Reich Chancellery, Hitler committed suicide along with Eva Braun in his underground bunker. On May 2nd, Berlin capitulated. Between May 4th and 8th, most of the remaining German armed forces surrendered unconditionally. In Italy, as Allied forces approached in April 1945, Mussolini's few remaining supporters melted away. Italian partisans found him on April 28th, hiding in the back of a German truck retreating along the western shore of Lake Como. They killed him along with his young mistress Clara Petacci and several fascist notables. They hung the bodies at a gas station in Milan after an embittered crowd had mutilated the Duce's corpse. The final radicalization shows fascism in its most distinctive form. The depth and strength of the fascist impulse to unleash destructive violence, even to the point of self-destruction, distinguishes it from other regimes. Expansionist war lies at the heart of radicalization. The Nazi regime reached the extreme limits of radicalization with its war of extermination against the Soviet Union. In that especially charged situation, Nazi officials felt free to take more violent actions than in the Western campaigns, first against the regime's enemies, then against fascism's conservative allies, and eventually against the German people themselves, in an ecstasy of terminal destruction. The final result was that the Italian and German fascist regimes hurtled over a precipice in their pursuit of ever more intoxicating successes. Mussolini had to take his fatal step toward war in June 1940 because fascist absence from Hitler's victory over France could have fatally loosened his grip on his people. Hitler never stopped imagining further conquests until he committed suicide in his besieged bunker. The fascisms we know seemed doomed to destroy themselves in their unbridled and obsessive race to fulfill the privileged relationship with history they had promised their people. Neo-fascism and radical populism, the persistent legacy of European fascism. When Allied forces entered Berlin in May 1945, and almost simultaneously Italian partisans hung Mussolini's body at a gas station in Milan, many contemporaries believed that fascism had been definitively defeated, not only on the military plane but also on the moral and historical one. The scale of destruction caused by fascist regimes, cities razed, tens of millions dead, collapsed states, seemed sufficient to irreversibly discredit what had promised national regeneration and had led instead to catastrophe. However, that impression proved incomplete. Even after total defeat, nuclei of the faithful continued to cling to the fascist experience, and veterans of Nazism and Italian fascism contributed to the formation of successor movements in practically every European country for at least a generation after the war. Germany concentrated the greatest concern of the victors from the start. Shortly after the beginning of the Allied occupation, a survey conducted in the American zone revealed that between 15% and 18% of the population remained ideologically committed to Nazism. Although these figures dropped rapidly to around 3% by the early 1950s, the context remained delicate. More than 10 million refugees of German origin, expelled in 1945 from Central and Eastern Europe, were resettled in the territory that would become the Federal Republic of Germany. Under those conditions, mass uprooting, initial poverty, and recent memory of the defeated regime, it was notable that the radical right remained relatively weak once political life was reactivated in the late 1940s. The Socialist Reich Party achieved 11% of the vote in Lower Saxony in 1951, but was banned the following year for its openly neo-Nazi character. Its main competitor, the German Reich Party, barely exceeded 1% during most of the 1950s, coinciding with the economic takeoff of West Germany. When various groups merged in 1964 to create the National Democratic Party, they managed to cross the 5% threshold in several regional elections and gain access to 7 state parliaments between 1966 and 1968, a period marked by economic difficulties and social tensions. However, they never achieved federal representation, reaching their high point in 1969 with 4.3% of the votes. In Italy, the legacy was more persistent. The Italian social movement emerged in 1946 as the direct heir of defeated fascism. Founded by Giorgio Almirante, a former collaborator of the ideological apparatus of the Italian Social Republic, the MSI obtained barely 1.9% in 1948, but stabilized for decades at around 4 to 5% of the electorate, reaching a maximum of 8.7% in 1972. Despite that sustained presence, the party remained isolated from the political system. For more than 30 years, no mainstream actor dared to break the cordon sanitaire surrounding it. These post-war neo-fascisms, however, seem destined to gradually die out as the generations directly shaped by Hitler and Mussolini disappeared. Against all expectations, the opposite occurred. Beginning in the late 1970s, and with greater force during the 1980s and 1990s, radical right movements entered a new phase of growth. This time, they did not do so as relics of the past, but as recipients of new grievances, articulated in a context profoundly different from that of interwar Europe. The turning point occurred around 1973. Western Europe then entered a decade of transition marked by profound structural transformations, aggravated by oil crises and economic contraction. The decline of traditional industries accelerated after the energy shocks of 1973 and 1979. Faced with competition from Asian economies with lower labor costs, burdened with expensive welfare systems, and dependent on increasingly expensive energy, Europe experienced for the first time since the 1930s long-term structural unemployment. In the new post-industrial society, access to work was radically transformed. Opportunities concentrated in sectors requiring higher educational levels, services, communications, technology, cultural industries, while broad groups of industrial workers and skilled artisans lost their position. This change tended to produce divided societies. One part of the population prospered, while another became trapped in a condition of permanent insecurity. Added to this was the erosion of traditional communities that had offered protection and collective meaning. Unions, workers' parties, industrial neighborhoods, weakened since the 1970s. Social insecurity was intensified by post-war immigration to Western Europe. During the years of growth, immigrants had been accepted as necessary labor. In a context of persistent unemployment, they came to be perceived as undesirable competitors. Moreover, the origin of immigration had changed. Now, coming from former colonies and culturally more distant regions, it gave rise to visible and permanent communities that maintained distinct languages, religions, and customs. For many Europeans, this was experienced as a threat not only economic but identitarian. That discontent was reinforced by a broader sense of loss of cultural control. Economic globalization and transnational youth culture, largely associated with American models, seemed to erode local traditions in the same way that the global market had dismantled national industries. Anti-immigrant resentment thus became fertile ground for new radical right movements. Some of them achieved notable electoral success. Jean-Marie Le Pen's Front National in France and Jörg Haider's Freedom Party in Austria based much of their appeal on the systematic exploitation of those fears. Parallel to this, a more violent and disturbing phenomenon emerged: the skinhead underworld. Uprooted, resentful, and marginalized young people developed a cult of action and aggression, expressed in neo-Nazi symbols, extreme music, and attacks against immigrants, sexual and racial minorities. In Germany, this violence reached an alarming peak in 1992, with more than 2,600 incidents recorded. Traditional parties reacted with difficulty. The Keynesian economic policies that had worked after 1945 no longer offered solutions without generating inflation. The state, formerly a guarantor of social security, saw its capacity limited by European integration and global markets. Welfare systems were under pressure just when demands were increasing. In this context, a new repertoire of enemies emerged: globalization, immigration, multiculturalism, environmental regulation, high taxes, and a political class perceived as incompetent. Disaffection toward the establishment opened space for an anti-politics that the extreme right knew how to exploit better than the radical left after 1989. Thus, during the 1980s and 1990s, a new generation of extreme right parties moved from the margins to central positions. Unlike their predecessors, they learned to moderate their language and distance themselves from explicit fascism. The more openly fascist a movement was, the less electoral success it tended to have. The Italian case is illustrative. After Almirante's death, the MSY initiated a transformation that culminated in its refoundation as Alleanza Nazionale, proclaiming the beginning of a post-fascist era. In their programs, clear echoes of classic fascism persisted: fear of decline, identitarian obsession, distrust of foreigners, and demand for authority, but central elements of historical fascism were missing: rejection of the market, denial of the rule of law, ambition for single-party dictatorship, or territorial expansion through war. Historical conditions had changed profoundly. Western Europe at the end of the 20th century was not the Europe of 1919. Most of its societies had known decades of peace, relative prosperity, and democratic stability. Historical fascism was not simply a style or a rhetoric, but a process born of specific crises in fragile democracies. Understanding that difference is essential. It is not a matter of identifying shirts or slogans, but of recognizing when the conditions that made that phenomenon possible converge again. Only thus can its past be understood and its possible return be watched for.